In February of 2002, filmmakers Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean joined together and spent 2 weeks writing a script for a film in Jim Henson's living room that would be inspired by Jim Henson's 1986 film Labyrinth. With a motley crew of film students, they turned that script into a feature-length film called MirrorMask. And today I'm going to take you through the film and explain the process that went into creating it. And the overall impression that it left on me is one of the most underrated pieces of cinema ever created. MirrorMask was released on September 30th, 2005, and was produced by the Jim Henson Company and Destination Films. It had a budget of only $4 million, and to put that into perspective, its predecessor and sister film, Labyrinth, had a budget of $25 million way back in 1986, which would be $45 million today. The reason I'm comparing MirrorMask directly to the film Labyrinth is because it's the sequel to Labyrinth, and I mean that in an unconventional sense. When I say that MirrorMask is a sequel to Labyrinth, I mean that in the same way that you might say the movie Zathura is a sequel to Jumanji. In fact, the trailer for Zathura can be found in the special features of the MirrorMask DVD. What I mean is that this film was directly inspired by and was meant to be a modern retelling of pretty much the same plot as Labyrinth with a much more mature and serious tone. You could almost say that this movie mirrors Labyrinth. Over the years, the two Jim Henson films, The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, have garnered an absolutely massive cult following, and for good reason. These are two incredible fantasy films that paved the way for hundreds of other movies to come, and MirrorMask was meant to be the third, the final film that Henson fans would place on their shelf to complete the trilogy. There's just one problem. MirrorMask has seemingly vanished. What I mean to say is that the film practically doesn't exist. It's literally, at the time of this video, a truly forgotten film. When I was in college, I watched The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and I remember Googling similar films to Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, and that's actually how I first found MirrorMask. Fast forward to current year, and the film has seemingly been scrubbed from existence. Even using a VPN, I couldn't find it on any of the streaming platforms in any country. I suspect that the supposed failure of this film as reaching cult status might have something to do with its initial critical response, as well as it being a film with a limited release. Having been released in very select areas and for a very limited amount of time, and receiving incredibly harsh and inaccurate criticisms from film experts. By the way, I've read some of the criticisms of this film, and they're complete BS, but that's a conversation we can have down in the comments if you'd like. I know my opinions are infallible, and absolutely everybody will agree with me. Now at this point, you might be asking yourself, but Diz, if this movie doesn't exist, how did you make this video? Well, I was lucky enough to find it on DVD for $60. So I guess it's possible for you to find it, but good luck. Oh yeah. My goal with this video is simple. I want to show enough people why I love this film and why it deserves to sit on shelves next to The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. And that hopefully someone important out there will see this and bring the film back into print. I know it's high hopes, but it's worth a shot. The initial screenplay for MirrorMask was written by Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman in Jim Henson's living room over the course of 2 weeks. Dave and Neil were initially contacted by Lisa Henson about possibly writing and directing a new film in the same vein as The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. The two had by this point written several graphic novels together and had worked on dozens of projects together, including short films and music videos. Initially, the Jim Henson Company wanted both of them on the project for this reason. The two would eventually sign on to the project, with Gaiman as the lead writer and McKean as director, although they would both play big roles in both writing and directing, with McKean later stating that Labyrinth would be used as the main starting point for the plot of MirrorMask. Labyrinth would be discussed at length and used as a rubric for the entire creative process of MirrorMask, and it's even featured as the very first film trailer in the special features of the MirrorMask DVD. The first graphic novel that Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean made together was called Violent Cases, the first work written by Gaiman and illustrated by McKean. This book was written by the duo in 1987 and was adapted for a stage play and had several editions. a graphic novel about a boy who's being treated for a broken arm by Al Capone's doctor. It's a story about stories and a meditation on childhood memory. Gaiman believed that McKean was an overall better storyteller than himself, so he would write a loose script for a short story with several holes in it that McKean could later fill in with his own ideas. And this was the sort of process that they had working together going forward. Gaiman would write a short story, and then McKean would then improve upon said story as well as add illustrations. In 1989, The Face magazine then commissioned the duo to write another graphic novel called Signal to Noise, a story about a dying filmmaker. In 1994, they came together for the third time and wrote the tragical comedy or the comical tragedy of Mr. Punch. The general story is paralleled with the traditional Mr. Punch show. Punch and Judy shows are totally foreign to American audiences, myself included, but it's an English tradition. All my UK viewers probably know what I'm talking about. This was meant to become a CD-ROM about Mr. Punch, which was actually what led to McKean's first introduction into film. Dave McKean's first introduction into the film world were in his short films The Week Before and Neon. He was introduced to producer Simon Moorhead, who then introduced him to director of photography Tony Shern. Dave ended up putting together a team of visual effects artists with Max McMullen. Together, this team made several short films and music videos. And Max McMullen would later work as the CG supervisor and producer on MirrorMask. If you're not entirely familiar with Dave McKean's work, in addition to being an artist, musician, author, and filmmaker, he was actually the concept artist for Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban and Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. You might have also seen some of his amazing artwork on album covers for bands like Machine Head and Counting Crows, just to name a few. Dave was inspired as a child by filmmakers such as Georges Méliès, who actually created one of the first films ever shown in a movie theater called A Trip to the Moon. You may be familiar with this if you've ever seen the movie Hugo. Méliès was practically the father of film editing, and his inspiration on McKean is prominent throughout a lot of McKean's work. The most notable works by Neil Gaiman that you're probably familiar with are his book Coraline, which was adapted into an animated film in 2009, and his book Stardust, which was adapted into a feature-length film in 2007. Not only was MirrorMask the very first feature-length film created by Gaiman and McKean, but it was actually the very first movie that anyone on the team had worked on. Literally all of the members of the VFX team had just come straight out of film school and had practically zero experience. This, coupled with the incredibly small budget they had to work with, is one of the aspects of this film that I find so incredibly impressive. And that's not even touching on the acting, which I'll get to later in the video. The film begins with the main protagonist, Helena Campbell, playing sock puppets in her bedroom. Well, inside her trailer, that is. A tribute to the puppets of Jim Henson. Immediately, we can see several references to characters that will appear later in the film. The first hint at the cerebral trip Helena is about to embark on. By the way, that's Stephanie Leonidas' foot on the right and the director Dave McKean's hand inside the black sock on the left. Her parents own a traveling circus and force her to participate as a performer. I'm instantly engaged by the setting and the tone of the film. Opening up to a circus as the setting, the film has a very smoky, jazzy, dreamlike tone that will last throughout most of the runtime. The creators of the film did a lot of work with color, and it's explained in the behind the scenes that at times they deliberately did slow crossfades of color going from sepia to a more full-bodied color palette to accentuate the scene. The opening scenes immediately evoke childhood memories of going to the circus when I was a kid, and I always really love the atmosphere and energy surrounding the circus. It just really makes me feel nostalgic and instantly engaged in what I'm watching. In the original script, Helena's parents owned a traveling theater, but Dave McKean thought a circus would be better. He was right, and he actually hired Arnett and Paulo's circus for the entire opening sequence of the film. Helena is clearly fed up with the traveling circus life and has an outburst with her mother, Joanne, who tries to coax her into performing. This leads to a very serious and emotional argument where Helena essentially wishes her mother dead.
You're gonna be the death of me.
I wish I was.
Shortly after, during the performance, Joanne falls ill and is rushed to the hospital. I can't help but notice at this point some very obvious parallels to Labyrinth, wherein the main protagonist Sarah wishes her baby brother Toby to be taken away by the Goblin King and turned into a goblin. A fate worse than death, basically.
I wish the goblins would come and take you away. Right now.
And it becomes obvious almost immediately that she didn't really mean what she said.
What's said is said.
But I didn't mean it.
Oh, you didn't?
This is the same situation with Helena and her mother. Obviously, she didn't actually wish her mother dead. It's a be careful what you wish for situation. 10 days later, Helena is staying with her grandmother and visiting Joanne in the hospital daily. I was so intrigued by the setting of this part of the film that I did quite an extensive bit of research on this location, and I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting this particular area of Brighton to have so much history, so allow me to briefly detract from the movie and discuss this filming location. So the location for her grandmother's flat was an extremely old building in Brighton called Embassy Court. Not only is this building nearly 90 years old, but it's actually the first penthouse block ever constructed in English history. After doing a bit of research, I found that an album was created just for the building by Scottish musician Chris Dukes called Sycamore Tubbs. The name is actually an anagram for the name Embassy Court.
Monolithic concertina at the junction of the channel.
By the way, all of the scenes inside her grandmother's flat were actually filmed inside an apartment at Embassy Court. Just an interesting little detail to take note of. The scene where Helena visits her mother immediately establishes this movie as incredibly well acted. The performances by both Stephanie Leonidas as well as Gina McKee are both incredibly believable and emotional. I really commend all of the actors in this movie. It's always really refreshing to see this caliber of acting in such an incredibly low-budget film.
There was a little girl. She had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good.
She returns home to find her father Morris and the circus performers discussing closing the circus, possibly indefinitely, so that her father can take care of her mother. Her father tells her that her mother is having surgery that night. It's never directly stated in the film, but it's heavily implied that her mother has cancer. Helena becomes infuriated at her father upon realizing that she's the last person to learn about her mother's surgery. Her father follows her up to the roof where they have an incredibly powerful and emotional conversation where Helena breaks down over previously wishing her mother dead.
I shouldn't have shouted at her. It's all my fault.
Hey, now don't say that. It's not your fault. Don't be silly. It's not anybody's fault. Yeah? These things happen.
Anyone who's lost someone due to cancer or even had a family member suffer as a result can really empathize with Helena and feel her pain firsthand. Around the first time I saw this film, my mother became extremely sick. For a short period of time, she was diagnosed with cancer and thankfully recovered completely. At the time, this scene hit me like a freight train, and I always thought about it for years and years after. To anyone who's actually lost a parent or a loved one, this scene is probably incredibly powerful and relatable. Stephanie's performance in this scene was largely improvisational and actually had everyone on set in tears. Dave McKean allowed the actors a lot of creative freedom on set, and it shows throughout the film. And this won't be the last time that his directing style would create some of the best and most well-acted scenes in MirrorMask, as we'll get to shortly. Later that night, while her mother's in surgery, Helena has an intense nightmare where she sees her mother dead on a gurney. In this bizarre dream, she gazes into a mirror and sees a seemingly evil and malevolent reflection of herself. This foreshadows major thematic elements that will become integral to the plot later on. She wakes up to strange violin music coming from outside and follows it downstairs where she finds several circus performers rehearsing in the courtyard. Initially, we see the mime Pingo, one of the performers from earlier, accompanied by two other unknown masked individuals. Full disclosure, this entire scene was actually filmed at night outside of Embassy Court with loud violin being played. Just kind of cracks me up imagining Dave McKean and a camera crew chasing the actors around the set in the dead of night while everyone's trying to sleep. It becomes apparent that none of the performers recognize Helena, and then suddenly a sinister dark shadow descends upon them and carbonizes the performers.
No, don't touch him!
Helena follows the last remaining performer through a doorway just as the darkness is about to consume them. We're then introduced to Valentine, my absolute favorite character in the film. He's played by actor Jason Barry, who you might recognize as one of the Irish mates in Titanic.
I'm Tommy Ryan. Jack Dawson. Hello.
He's absolutely fantastic in this role, and he plays the part using his natural, thick Irish brogue.
Well, you'll love this. It's great crack. I'm mad for crack.
McKean really let him play this role the way he wanted to play it, and much of his dialogue is totally improvised. Helena and Valentine are confronted by a strange creature, one of the many sphinxes that will appear in the film. They discover that there's no escape from the junk room they're trapped in, so Valentine explains that all unwanted books will return themselves to the library. So they begin verbally attacking the books so they can ride them to safety. A very strange concept indeed.
Nasty! Poorly paced book with a soppy ending that I didn't believe in for 1 minute!
We see a very weird spider-like creature with a large eyeball spying on them at this moment. This creature will play a very important role later on. I'd like to take a moment to show some appreciation towards the music of MirrorMask. all of which was composed by Ian Bellamy, who makes some very minor appearances in the film. The soundtrack mostly consists of a very sort of avant-garde style of jazz with heavy bass lines and clarinet solos.
What is that? Someone made a tape with something dying or something.
Hey, turn that crap off! What's going on?
I want this music out of my head.
Hey, turn that off! Turn that off right now!
I don't know much about jazz, but I credit this film as fundamentally changing my taste in music for the better. I just fell in love with that clarinet, and I always thought it was the perfect background music to complement Dave McKean's unique set pieces. We then cut to the first glimpse of the Queen of Shadows, and you'll probably notice that her castle is an evil and corrupted version of Embassy Court, the real-world location where Helena is currently staying. We see that the spider eyeball creature from earlier is her spy. After escaping from the junk room in the previous scene, Helena and Valentine have an opportunity to become officially acquainted with one another, and we learn that Valentine was planning on leaving the city with his fellow performers before they were carbonized. We instantly get a deeper feel for Valentine's slightly vacant and shallow personality, but we'll learn later on that this was mostly surface level. For example, as he's mourning the loss of his friends, he becomes distracted and then seemingly forgets that they ever existed. We learn from Valentine that not only is everyone in the dream world some sort of circus performer, but that they all wear masks, as he seems put off by Helena's bare face. He's a complex character, as he comes off as both rude and shallow, commenting on Helena's appearance and name, but at the same time lovable and endearing, reminiscing about his friends and their plans. He's vacant and forgetful, but somehow very clever at the same time. It's instantly implied that Valentine will serve as the comic relief for the remainder of the film. If you pay attention during this scene, you'll see some very interesting background characters that serve to make the city seem more lively and busy. In the original screenplay for the film, Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean came up with several strange creatures that would be walking around in the foreground, and gave them strange names like Mr. Shoe Thing or Mr. Book Thing, and planned on letting the animators come up with their own unique designs. But as you'll see in the film, the animators took these temporary names totally literally and made Mr. Shoe Thing a giant walking shoe, Miss Fish Thing became a giant talking fish, Mr. Book Thing became a walking stack of books. During a Q&A session, Gaiman and McKean were asked how many digital fish were used in the film. This really bothered them and became sort of a running joke, as they were never able to give a definitive answer, being that there's quite literally thousands of fish used. So you can imagine how hard I laughed when viewing the behind the scenes footage when I saw their official answer was finally revealed.
The answer to the ultimate question is 42.
We learn that Valentine and the townspeople were in the process of evacuating the city as the darkness seen earlier begins consuming everything in sight. Suddenly, Helena is arrested by the town police as they believe her to be the princess of the city.
I'm not dangerous.
Dangerous, not dangerous, same thing.
Am I under arrest?
Not exactly, miss. Or should I say, princess?
This is ridiculous.
As she's being escorted away, she passes by a window and sees herself asleep in the real world and discovers that she's trapped in a dream.
It's me. I'm asleep. This is just a dream. It's not real.
The police bring Helena to the Castle of Light, where she's introduced to the Prime Minister, played by Rob Brydon, the same actor who plays Helena's father. Just in case you're still not convinced that this film was intended to be a modern reimagining of Labyrinth, I'll just point out that the Prime Minister was originally going to be played by none other than David Bowie, and Bowie's son, screenwriter Duncan Jones, was originally at the read-through for the film. But as you might imagine, this would have been quite an ask given the $4 million budget of the film. Frankly, I'm glad that they went with Rob Brydon for this role, as many of my favorite childhood films typically use the same actor playing one of the main character's parents as playing a character in the fantasy world.
It's time for you to grow up.
Just think happy thoughts. They lift you into the air.
Alas, I have no happy thoughts.
That brings you down.
It adds more meaning and depth to the story, and in MirrorMask, both of Helena's parents become manifest within the dream world in some form or fashion, which directly plays into the psychology of the film to the betterment of the plot. As Helena arrives at the Castle of Light, the Prime Minister is in the process of looking for a certain charm. Many of the townsfolk attempt to offer him random objects in the hope of receiving a reward. One of these townspeople is played by Rusty Goff, one of the original Oompa Loompas. That was a random side note, I just thought it was funny. After the Prime Minister realizes that Helena isn't the princess, he explains that originally there were two kingdoms, the City of Light and the Land of Shadows. One day, the Princess of Shadows came to the City of Light and was welcomed as one of their own, but then stole the charm and disappeared. leaving the Queen of Light in a permanent sleep-like state. He explains that the charm is a gateway upon which the whole world balances. Helena realizes that this is all just her dream, and vows to find the charm to wake the Queen from her slumber and bring balance back to the City of Light, thus saving the world. From this point on, anytime you see anything with a silvery white glint, this is symbolic of the Queen of Light and indicates something important that will lead Helena in the right direction. Helena and Valentine decide to search the library for any information regarding the charm. It's here that we're introduced to the librarian, a very interesting character who's unrecognizably played by Stephen Fry. He tells Helena the creation story of the dream world, and we discover that it is in fact a manifestation and reflection of her mind, that it exists within her imagination, but specifically her drawings. Specifically her wall of drawings that was shown earlier in the film, and that not only had she created the City of Light, but the Land of Shadows as well. According to McKean, this is the reason why everything in the dream world has a slight fakeness and two-dimensional quality. We discovered that the dream world was all a reflection of Helena's conflicting personality and personal struggles, and that the charm in question was a symbol of the eternal boundlessness of Helena's imagination, as the dream world is merely a mirror image of her life, that as long as she lives and grows, so too would the dream world. The librarian then gives Helena the really useful book, which will play a very important part throughout her journey. My favorite thing about the librarian's character design has to be the fact that despite being just a hodgepodge of random objects, they decided to just put Stephen's mouth on a shard of glass, just to make him slightly recognizable. Hilariously, he actually performed all his dialogue in under half an hour, and called his mom in the middle of recording just to wish her a happy birthday. What a guy. It's a shame this character doesn't appear again in the film. The really useful book leads Helena and Valentine towards a sun-shaped object off in the distance. Along the way, Helena notices that the buildings all look like her drawings, and upon looking through a window, she once again finds herself looking into her bedroom in the real world. Finally, they come upon two floating giants who explain that the charm is the MirrorMask. They give Helena a box containing a key, and once again you can see the glint I mentioned earlier. Just as they pass the box to Helena, they're overcome by the darkness. Gaiman would later explain that this separation of the giants is symbolic of Helena's parents, as one of the giants is pulled down and succumbs to the darkness, representing her mother's death, and the other giant floating off into the void represents her father dealing with the loss. A truly sad and depressing thought, but one of the many small details that gives me so much appreciation for the storytelling ability of Neil Gaiman. With key in hand, they continue on their journey towards the sun-shaped object on the horizon, and come across a mask shop. Inside the shop, we're introduced to Miss Bagwell, an old lady wearing a very creepy mask and surrounded by dozens of sphinxes. When Helena looks through the bathroom window, she sees an evil version of herself in her bedroom screaming and arguing with her father. When filming this scene, Stephanie Leonidas was actually literally screaming in Rob Brydon's face using heavy profanity, none of which can be heard in the film. Her performance was so convincing that Rob was later found backstage trembling with a cup of coffee. This guy's a world-renowned actor, and Stephanie's performance left him shaking. Absolutely incredible. The atmosphere in the mask shop suddenly turns very sinister as the sphinxes all take on a very intimidating pose towards Helena and Valentine. The very useful book then instructs Helena not to let them see that she's afraid. And if you listen very carefully here, you'll notice that the song being played throughout this scene is actually repeating the line, "Don't let them see you're afraid," over and over again. A very interesting little detail that totally went over my head on my first viewing, just making me appreciate Ian Bellamy's work even more.
Don't let them see you're afraid.
There's a few moments in the film where we see the Queen of Shadows vomiting out the darkness. I think it's implied that she's the main source of the darkness we see overwhelming the City of Light. This too is symbolic of Helena's parents, specifically her relationship with her mother. Although we don't see much of their relationship outside of the film, it can likely be assumed that the confrontation between the two at the start of the film is ongoing and chronic, and the darkness is emblematic of her mother's overbearing nature, which ultimately causes Helena to lash out at her. It's clear that Helena views her mother's negativity as being the cause of her own negativity as well. Helena and Valentine finally reach their destination and discover a giant tower leading into the sky. Upon entering the tower, Helena discovers a pack of strange gorilla-like creatures with bird-like features, a creature so aptly referred to as the monkey birds. Suddenly, the darkness comes upon them and Helena is rescued by one of the monkey birds who lifts her into the sky. The glint of light appears again and leads them to the borderlands between the City of Light and the Land of Shadow. Helena has a vision of her mother, or the Queen of Light, and I just can't get over the feeling that this is all very similar to Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, the sequel to Alice in Wonderland. That the Queen of Light was directly inspired by the White Queen in Carroll's story, which makes even more sense when considering that the Queen of Darkness may have been inspired by the Red Queen as well. At one point in the vision, Helena's mother remarks that it's actually her dream they're in and not Helena's, which is a strikingly similar comment to one made by the Red King in Through the Looking Glass. It's suggested that Alice herself could have simply been a character existing in the Red King's dreams. The story even ends with Alice awakening from her dream and realizing that everything in her dream world, as well as all of the characters she had encountered, had just been objects in her bedroom, exactly the same as Helena's drawings. And keep in mind that a looking glass is just another term for a mirror. Helena and Valentine discover a strange room containing a large key cabinet, and then suddenly the evil version of Helena existing in the real world begins destroying all of her drawings, which causes instability in the dream world. This really reminds me of the never-ending story, specifically the way the drawings represent and directly influence the dream world and its destruction, much in the same way that Fantasia exists inside of Bastian's book. When filming the scene, the set with the key cabinet was all on hydraulic springs so they could simulate an earthquake, but this made it extremely hard for the actors to walk around without falling over. I really don't understand why they didn't just opt for a simple shaky cam effect, but maybe they just thought this method would come off as more organic and realistic. Our expectations are then totally subverted, as after Helena becomes injured, Valentine decides to totally betray her and lead the Queen of Shadows directly to her. This goes back to what I said earlier about Valentine being a very complex and unpredictable character. When Helena finally confronts the Queen of Shadows, it becomes obvious that the evil version of her who took her place in the real world was actually the Princess of Shadows who'd run away from home. The very princess discussed by the Prime Minister earlier in the film. That she's ostensibly taken Helena's place in the real world using the MirrorMask, and that the Queen of Shadows had mistaken Helena as her daughter. Gaiman and McKean would later state that in the early stages of writing the screenplay, they had wanted the story to be loosely inspired by The Prince and the Pauper. Of course, they would eventually take inspiration from several different sources, specifically Labyrinth and Alice in Wonderland. The Queen of Shadows explains that it was actually the princess causing the dream world to collapse, a direct parallel to Helena allegedly causing her mother's illness. I know I keep harping on this, but the acting in this movie is extraordinary. Every actor in this scene shines. Gina McKee is incredible. She plays this part so perfectly it's chilling. She transitions from the loving Queen of Light into the Queen of Shadows, and it's as if you're watching a completely different person. You can really feel the agony in Stephanie's performance as well, the anger and sorrow as she discovers Valentine's betrayal. This next sequence is by far my favorite scene in the film. The Queen of Shadows attempts to transform Helena into her daughter via the creepiest makeover imaginable. Helena is surrounded by several corpse-like clockwork automatons that begin transforming her into the Princess of Shadows while singing an incredibly eerie version of Close to You by Burt Bacharach. It's beautiful while at the same time very creepy and off-putting and just perfect.
Why do birds suddenly appear every time you are near? Just like me, they long to be close to you.
I love everything about this scene. This version of the song Close to You was directly inspired by a cover of the song composed by Wayne Horvitz. Dave McKean instructed Ian Bellamy to recreate Horvitz's version of the song using flowing, counterintuitive, and uneasy chords played in minor key. This unnerving and creepy version of the song is just absolutely perfect for this scene.
Just like me, they long to be close to you.
Valentine returns to the key cabinet where he uses the key to discover the hiding place of the MirrorMask, only to find a letter written by the Princess of Shadows explaining that she had used the mask to leave the dream world and swap places with Helena. After failing to recover the MirrorMask, Valentine returns to Helena and apologizes. When she awakens from her trance, they search the princess's bedroom and discover the MirrorMask hiding inside of the bedroom mirror. Helena then realizes that all the windows she'd seen throughout the film had been the portals back to the real world, and that the MirrorMask was the key. This is why she was able to peer back into the real world every time she looked through a window. Just as they're escaping from the castle... Alright, I'll just skip that part. Helena and Valentine are pursued by the Queen of Shadows, who now appears as a giant floating head covered in black tendrils. They're then saved at the last minute, Deus Ex Machina style, by Valentine's house, which is a flying tower. Helena finds a window in the tower just as the last drawing is about to be destroyed by the Princess of Shadows, but Valentine hesitates to hand her the mask as he considers stealing her one ticket back to the real world, and due to his hesitation, the last drawing is destroyed before they can escape, permanently trapping Helena in the dream world. After destroying all the drawings in Helena's bedroom, the Princess of Shadows then throws all of them off the roof of Embassy Court, but she overlooks one final drawing, the chalk drawing that Helena drew on the rooftop after learning of her mother's surgery. Helena uses the MirrorMask at this moment and switches places with the princess, thus bringing balance back to the dream world and saving the Queen of Light. The moment when Helena switches places with the Princess of Shadows is by far my favorite special effect in the entire film. It's just so seamless and perfect. Filming this scene actually took 3 attempts, and on the 3rd try, Stephanie tripped and slammed her head into the ground so hard that it was audible to everyone on set, but after a short hospital visit, she was able to quickly recover and finish filming the next day. Helena is then woken up by her father and they receive a phone call that her mother's surgery was successful. And once again, the performance by both actors in the scene is just so powerful and moving. In the final scene of the film, Helena is back to performing in the circus and is bumped into by Valentine as he would appear in the real world. Principal photography for MirrorMask began at Black Island Studios, London, with 2 weeks of on-location filming and 4 weeks in a blue screen studio. Given the incredibly small budget of MirrorMask, McKean was forced to come up with creative solutions to create a feature-length film of the same caliber as Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. They were unable to afford a legitimate post house and didn't even have enough money to use the Jim Henson Creature Shop. This is a Henson film, and they couldn't even use the Jim Henson Creature Shop. This led to McKean reverting back to some of his old methods that he used to make some of his short films. He procured the services of 15 CG artists who had recently graduated from Bournemouth University. Although these artists were very inexperienced, this actually allowed McKean much more creative control over his team as he supervised every aspect of the film, with Max McMullen leading the team. He actually had each member of the team animate their own specific section of the film so that he could capture multiple animation styles in one movie. Initially, McKean had planned on filming the entire movie digitally with the Viper film stream system, which was a new technology at the time and just wasn't quite ready yet. However, he did manage to use the Viper for a few of the shots in the film. Because of this huge issue, they decided to use traditional 35mm film just 2 weeks before filming started, which was a huge setback for McKean and created a plethora of issues that hadn't previously been considered, and also led to budget difficulties involving scanning and film processing. A lot of the technical issues of using traditional film had to do with the use of green screens, as the process of keying a green screen on traditional film is much more difficult and time-consuming than doing so on digital. Most of the characters in MirrorMask were completely computer-generated, with some being hand-animated in a program called Maya, with some motion capture implemented as well, which was all done at Artem Digital, with McKean actually performing most of the motion capture himself. McKean actually laid on a table and performed all the motion capture for the scene with the two floating giants when Helena gets the key. Artem Digital would then send the motion capture files to McKean's team, who would then finalize them, adding details to the character skeletons to create the CG characters you see in the film. McKean produced all of the storyboards in the film, as well as illustrations for every single character, and due to McKean's amazing directing ability, very little work was needed to actually match the live actors up with the CG characters seen in the film, likely saving them a lot of time and effort. In addition to this, McKean also hand-created all of the textures on all of the models seen throughout the film. All of the creatures in the film with human-like faces were originally animated with white masks, and then after capturing the actors' performances, their faces would then be superimposed onto the characters using Maya. In some cases, when a live-action actor had to interact with one of the animated creatures, a blue screen suit would be used. For example, in the scene where Helena is carried away by a monkey bird, they had a large prop man in a blue suit lift her up while a cable rig launched her off the ground. In the scene with the giant floating head, only the slight head movements and mouth movements are actually the actress Gina McKee. The VFX team blended her head and mouth movements onto a digital model using the same process I described earlier. Then add a digital set created by McKean using Photoshop in the background, and this is pretty much the basis for most of the scenes in the film. To create the backgrounds in the film, McKean would digitally scan his own paintings, drawings, and actual objects, and blend them in Photoshop, and then animate them into the film using After Effects. Here's a list of just some of the software used to make MirrorMask: Maya, Houdini, After Effects, Photoshop, Mental Ray, Smedge, and FX Cluster, just to name a few. According to an interview with McKean, all of the original computers used to make the film were named after the Beatles: John, Paul, Ringo, and George. Shortly after the fifth computer, Yoko, was introduced, the original four computers refused to talk to each other. McKean would later go on to say regarding their render farm RAID arrays that they had named them after the Ramones in the hopes that they would render very quickly, to which McKean remarked that they would render very quickly, but then they'd burn out and fall apart. At times, while in the blue screen studio, there would be people filming commercials and adverts in the studios to the left and right of the MirrorMask studio. These ads would only take 1 day of filming, so in the morning they would very noisily build their set, and at the end of the day very noisily destroy their set, which made it very difficult for McKean to film certain scenes with all that noise in the background, even though the studio advertised itself as being soundproof. And just a little trivia here, but one of the scenes where they had a huge problem with this was the scene inside of Mrs. Bagwell's house. Although the vast majority of characters in MirrorMask are completely CG, I just have to show some appreciation for what some of the actors had to go through with some of the cosmetics and costumes in the film. Anytime you see an actor in a movie with heavy makeup and prosthetics, you can be sure that they're probably in constant agony for the entire filming process. They likely have to wake up at the crack of dawn to get into makeup, which probably takes several hours, which they then have to wear for the remainder of the day. And they do this every single day for the entire filming process of the entire movie. Both Jason Barry and Gina McKee particularly had a very hard time with the makeup, and it didn't help that filming took place in the middle of summer. Jason, who played Valentine in the film, was forced to wear a mask with tiny little eye holes that gave him migraine headaches, and Gina had allergic reactions to the face makeup, causing them to tone down her makeup partway through the film. Just imagine having a bunch of garbage glued to your face from early in the morning until 5 p.m. Imagine not being able to see or breathe or scratch an itch on your nose. A true testament to how brilliant these actors are. While listening to the DVD commentary track for this film, I couldn't help but find it funny listening to Dave and Neil talk about all the different countless software and special cameras required to do some of the special effects back in 2005, when literally all of this could be done today by one person with one computer just using After Effects. Most of it, at least. Listening to how much effort it took just to do something as simple as a lens flare effect is pretty astonishing. I could do a lens flare effect tracked along a set path in After Effects in about 5 minutes. It just really goes to show how limited the technology at the time was with such a small budget, and is just once again a testament to the raw skill of these filmmakers to pull this off. And now I'd just like to simply list off some of the interesting things about the creation of this movie, which were just too random to neatly fit into this video in any kind of organized way. At the very start of the film, there's a puppet of Valentine in Helena's room. The entire fight scene between Helena and her mother at the beginning of the movie was actually filmed about a year after the rest of the movie was finished. During the circus performance at the beginning of the movie, there's a brief shot of a performer doing contact juggling with 4 crystal balls, which is an homage to Jareth from Labyrinth. Although all of the actors in the film had juggling lessons, most of the actual juggling at the beginning of the film was done by doubles who were very cleverly wearing masks to hide their faces. McKean lends his voice to the film on the game show that Helen is watching with her grandmother, as well as on the hospital's loudspeaker. When Helen is walking out of her mother's hospital room, you can actually hear a version of the song Close to You playing over the loudspeaker. When Helena arrives at the Castle of Light, the set in the background is actually a burnt computer chip found on a beach by the CG supervisor. In the dream world, Ginger Street is actually based off of Trieste. All of the streets in the dream world were based on Dave's favorite European cities. When the Sphinx is eating the Very Useful book, the actor was actually eating rice paper. The set as Helena and Valentine are walking up to the dark castle is completely made out of fleas under a microscope. The scene where Helena is in between the light and dark lands having a vision of her mother is scene 63 and was never completed. Filming for this scene started on the very first day of filming and ended on the very last day of filming. And if you pay close attention, you can actually see Helena's mother slowly transforming into the Queen of Light as her outfit changes at every single camera cut. In the scene where evil Helena is on the roof at the end of the movie, they had to set up a track over the edge of the building to capture the shot right as the sun rose at 4 a.m. There were a total of 70 masks used in the film, 10 total days on location filming, 20 days in the studio, total number of effect shots 1,139, number of animation days per shot 3.5, number of animators on the film 15. Very unusually for a Jim Henson film, there are no actual puppets used in the film, other than the ones you see in Helena's room at the very beginning. Total number of scenes in the script 135, total number of pages in the script 107 and 3/4. Have you had enough? Should I keep going? By this point, 90% of you probably stopped watching this video. If somehow you end up seeing this film and enjoy it, there is actually a sequel of sorts. Not exactly a sequel in the traditional sense, but it's just a very similar movie made by Dave McKean with a very similar tone, same style, and it even has the same actor Stephanie Leonidas playing the main character. It's called Luna. It was directed and written by Dave McKean, and while I'm not quite as much of a fan of this one, it's definitely worth a watch. And like MirrorMask, it deals with the psychology of loss and memory. Now, I would tell you at this point to go watch MirrorMask, but I can't because you probably won't find it. Unless you live in the UK possibly, even with a VPN, you're not going to be able to find it on Amazon or Google. Not only can you not find it on any legal streaming service or website, but it's also no longer in print, so you won't even find it on DVD for less than $50. If anyone who worked on this movie sees this video, please make this masterpiece more available and easily accessible. It's a damn shame that this movie is so hidden from the general public. My hopes for this video, once again, are that it'll catch the attention of the right people and hopefully one day go back into print and show up on popular streaming sites and eventually garner as much of a cult following as its predecessors Labyrinth and Dark Crystal and finally achieve the recognition that it deserves. Well, I hope all of that was very informative and entertaining. And if you like this video, please go check out the rest of my channel. And please consider liking this video and subscribing. And if you like this content, please go check out my other channel where my best friend and I are doing some more laid back movie reviews. And now I'm going to let the director and creator of MirrorMask close out the video. Thanks a lot for watching.
Really, you can do anything at home with a Mac and some software that anybody in Hollywood or anybody else is doing. So it really comes down to the ideas. It really comes down to what sort of film you want to do, what you want to say, something you feel passionate about, something you want to tell people, something that makes you laugh. And just do it. I kind of have a feeling that it feels like another huge step in film history, really. It's almost like as big a step as is in the 20s, the move to sound. I think a whole new way of dealing with film, a whole different kind of film is going to come out of this.
You were the one who said you wanted monkey birds. My son roller skates. I said they'll be small, they're easy, we can wind them up. No, you said you wanted monkey birds.